The universe possesses a remarkably dry sense of humor. Handing me the master keys to a 200-unit, low-income housing complex at the ripe age of 25 was a joke in itself. Handing me the lease agreement of the girl who had made my teenage years a waking, suffocating nightmare was the punchline. People often say that living well is the best revenge. They clearly lack imagination. Sometimes the best revenge is simply sitting behind a faux wood laminate desk, holding the power to ruin someone's Tuesday, and deciding exactly how much slack to give the rope before it snaps. The building was a sprawling, brutalist concrete block sitting on the gritty edge of the industrial district. I managed the beast for a phantom owner who lived halfway across the globe, content to cash the checks and ignore the leaky pipes. Because he didn't care, I cared entirely too much. I was the bleeding heart dictator of our little vertical neighborhood. If a tenant was running from a bruised past, I found a vacant corner unit and furnished it with mismatched, donated armchairs that smelled faintly of lavender and old dust. If someone came up short on rent, I let them paint the fire doors or pull weeds in the cracked courtyard to cover the difference. I bought groceries for the elderly residents, mediated domestic squabbles with an iron fist, and knew the names of every stray cat that lingered by the dumpsters. In return, the tenants treated me with a fierce, almost feral loyalty. Then there was Elias. He was the head of maintenance, though the title hardly covered the breadth of what he actually did. Elias smelled permanently of sawdust, engine grease, and black coffee. He had the kind of rough, calloused hands that could coax a dying boiler back to life, and a crooked, insolent smirk that made my stomach execute entirely inappropriate gymnastics. He was my right hand, my enforcer, and the unspoken tension between us was a live wire we danced around daily. Our banter was a shield, but every time his shoulder brushed mine in the cramped supply closet, the air grew thick enough to choke on. I didn't even process the name on the lease at first. We had 5 move-ins that week, a blur of paperwork and handed-over keys. It wasn't until a Tuesday afternoon when the heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open that the past walked right into my present. Valerie. She marched in carrying the exact same aura of synthetic coconut perfume and unearned entitlement that she had wielded like a weapon in high school. Her hair was still that blinding, unnatural shade of platinum, and her acrylic nails clicked against her phone screen with aggressive rhythm. In high school, she had tormented me for my thrift store clothes, my quiet demeanor, and my utter lack of social capital. She had once poured a carton of spoiled milk into my locker, ruining my favorite boots, simply because she was bored. Sitting in my office watching her through the glass partition, a sharp spike of adrenaline flushed my cheeks. I expected a confrontation immediately, but Valerie just grabbed her welcome packet from the front desk, oblivious. She didn't look at the property manager's name on the door. She didn't recognize the woman behind the desk as the scrawny girl she used to terrorize. To her, I was just part of the furniture. It took exactly 6 days for the illusion to shatter. I was standing in the center of the lobby, holding a clipboard and discussing a frayed elevator cable with Elias. The afternoon sun was slicing through the grimy clear-story windows, highlighting the golden flecks in Elias' dark eyes. He was leaning entirely too close, explaining the mechanics of a pulley system, his deep voice a low rumble that vibrated pleasantly in my chest. "If the counterweight isn't recalibrated," Elias murmured, his gaze dropping momentarily to my lips, "we're going to have a lot of people trapped between floors." Before I could formulate a witty, entirely deflective response, the elevator doors shrieked open. Out stormed Valerie. She zeroed in on me, her face pinched into a mask of pure, aristocratic fury. In her hand, she gripped a piece of peeling laminate she had clearly ripped from the baseboard of her kitchen. "Who is running this absolute dump?" she barked, her voice echoing off the cheap terrazzo floors. "I demand to speak to the manager, now." I turned slowly. I handed the clipboard to Elias, whose jaw had already tightened. "I'm the property manager," I said, my voice eerily calm, smooth as glass. Valerie marched up, practically vibrating with rage, ready to unleash a tirade, but as she drew close, her eyes narrowed. The rant died in her throat. Recognition dawned slow and ugly, twisting her features. "No," she scoffed, a harsh, grating sound. "No way, you the charity case, you're the one in charge of this slum." Elias shifted his weight, stepping half in front of me, his muscles tensing under his flannel shirt. I put a hand on his forearm to stop him. The heat of his skin beneath the fabric was grounding. "I manage the property, yes," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "And if you have a maintenance request, you can submit it in writing. Tearing the fixtures apart isn't the protocol." "Protocol?" she shrieked, her volume drawing the attention of everyone in the lobby. "I pay good money to live here. You think because you somehow crawled your way into a pathetic desk job, you can talk down to me. You're still the same pathetic little trash you were in 11th grade. The lobby fell dead silent. Mrs. Gable, a terrifyingly sharp octogenarian who lived on the fourth floor, paused mid-step, her grocery bags dangling from her wrists. A group of teenagers who usually loitered by the vending machines lowered their phones. The air in the room shifted, turning thick and heavy. "Grow up, Valerie," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the absolute quiet. "We are adults. I won't be taking any disrespect from you, and I certainly won't tolerate a tantrum in my lobby. Fill out a work order or go back upstairs." She sneered, throwing the piece of baseboard onto the floor at my feet. "You haven't changed, you're still a nobody." She spun on her heel and marched back to the elevator, her heavy footsteps ringing like gunshots. Elias let out a low whistle, bending down to pick up the discarded wood. "Friend of yours." "An old ghost," I muttered, my hands trembling ever so slightly, not from fear, but from the massive effort it took to keep my composure. I didn't plan what happened next. I didn't orchestrate it, and I certainly didn't ask for it. But the building was a living, breathing organism. It had eyes, ears, and a fiercely protective immune system. And it had just identified a virus. By the next morning, the war had begun. I arrived at my office to find a freshly brewed coffee on my desk and Elias leaning against the doorframe, a wicked gleam in his eye. "You might want to check the third-floor corridor," he said casually, taking a sip from his own mug. When I walked up, I found it. Someone, I suspected the teenagers from the lobby, had designed a spectacularly crude, highly unflattering caricature of Valerie. It depicted her as a screeching gargoyle. But they hadn't just taped it to her door. They had used industrial-grade construction adhesive. It was cemented to the painted steel, impossible to remove without taking the paint and primer with it. That was only the beginning. The tenants, communicating through an unspoken, telepathic network of shared grievance, made it their mission to break her. If Valerie walked through the courtyard, people would stop their conversations and stare, coughing loudly and muttering insults under their breath. When she did her laundry, her wet clothes mysteriously found their way out of the dryers and onto the folding tables, still dripping. The crowning achievement, however, belonged to Elias. A week into the silent siege, the apartment directly above Valerie's became vacant. On a Friday afternoon, Elias hauled a massive, commercial-grade floor buffer up to the empty unit. He turned it on, set it to its most aggressive, vibrating setting, locked the door, and casually left for a 3-day weekend. I spent that Saturday evening in the office, catching up on paperwork while the rhythmic, distant hum of the buffer shook the dust from the ceiling tiles. The front door chimed, and Elias walked in carrying a greasy paper bag smelling heavily of garlic and fried noodles. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, nudging my paperwork aside to set down 2 cartons of takeout. "You're a menace, you know that?" I said, nodding upward toward the muffled vibration. "She's going to lose her mind." Elias chuckled, leaning over the desk. The dim light of my desk lamp cast deep shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw. "She tried to make you feel small in your own kingdom. I'm just doing a little preventative maintenance." He walked around the desk, stopping right beside my chair. The air in the tiny office suddenly felt unbearably thin. He reached out, his rough fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His touch was warm, deliberate. "You take care of everyone in this concrete box," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave, rough as sandpaper. "Let us take care of you for once." I looked up into his eyes, the bantering remarks I usually relied on evaporating. The distance between us vanished. When he kissed me, it wasn't hesitant. It was a collision, a release of months of pent-up, simmering tension. His hands found my waist, pulling me up from the chair, the taste of black coffee and adrenaline intoxicating. I tangled my fingers in his hair, the hum of the floor buffer above us vibrating through the soles of my shoes, matching the frantic rhythm in my chest. We broke apart only when the need for oxygen became absolute, his forehead resting against mine, both of us breathing heavily in the quiet office. By Wednesday, Valerie broke. She shoved her way into my office, looking absolutely haggard. The platinum hair was greasy and tied in a messy knot. Dark circles bruised the skin under her eyes, the result of sleep deprivation and constant, relentless paranoia. She looked cornered. "I need out," she choked out, her hands slamming flat onto my desk. "I want out of this lease, now." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. I channeled every ounce of magnanimous, professional grace I possessed. I didn't gloat, I didn't smirk. That would have cheapened the victory. "Breaking a lease early incurs a penalty fee, Valerie. 2 months' rent plus forfeiture of the security deposit." "I don't care," she shrieked, her voice cracking. Keep the money, keep the deposit, just give me the paperwork. These people are insane. This whole building is cursed. I'll draw up the release forms, I said smoothly. For your own safety, of course, things do seem to be escalating. She signed the papers with a violently shaking hand, nearly tearing the page, and stormed out without another word. Moving day arrived that Saturday. The universe, having delivered the punchline, demanded an encore. Elias and I stood in the small security room behind the front desk, staring at the grainy black and white feed from the lobby camera. Two burly movers were hauling Valerie's heavy, ornate bedroom furniture through the front doors. They hauled a massive dresser toward the elevator bank, dragging it across the terrazzo. Elias leaned against the counter, his arm wrapped casually around my waist. With his free hand, he reached into the chest pocket of his overalls and pulled out a small, jagged brass key. The elevator override key. He held it up to the light, inspecting it with feigned curiosity. You know, the strangest thing happened this morning. I seem to have misplaced the service key. The elevator is locked on the 7th floor for routine inspection. I bit my lip, suppressing a laugh that threatened to bubble over. A tragedy, I suppose they'll have to use the stairs. Valerie lived on the 5th floor. We watched the monitor as Valerie jabbed the elevator call button frantically. Once, twice, 10 times, nothing happened. The movers, sweating profusely, dropped the heavy dresser to the floor and gestured toward the stairwell door. Even through the silent security feed, the explosion was magnificent. Valerie went utterly ballistic. She kicked the reinforced steel doors of the elevator, her foot recoiling in visible pain. She spun around, screaming at the movers, throwing her arms in the air in a spectacular, unhinged tantrum. She stomped over to the management office, finding the heavy glass door locked, and began slapping her palms against the glass like a trapped bird. I stood in the safety of the security room, leaning back against Elia's solid chest. He pressed a warm kiss to the top of my head, chuckling softly. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, watching the screen as the girl who had once made me feel entirely powerless wept in frustration over a flight of stairs. It was petty, it was vindictive. It was probably a step too far for someone who prided herself on being the benevolent guardian of the building. But as I watched her finally concede defeat, trudging toward the stairwell behind her groaning movers, I allowed myself one deeply satisfied smirk. Looking back years later, I realized that holding onto resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. True maturity is letting go of the past and rising above the cruelty of others. But occasionally, just once in a lifetime, karma needs a little administrative assistance. The choices we make echo in the spaces we inhabit, and if you choose to bring toxicity into a community built on mutual survival, the community will spit you out. It taught me that family isn't just blood. It's the people who stand with you, who silence the bullies, and who intentionally misplace an elevator key just to see you smile. And if you're very lucky, amidst the chaos of broken leases and petty revenge, you might just find someone who makes the heavy lifting entirely worth it. If you've ever had a moment where the universe handed you the perfect opportunity to balance the scales, share it in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more stories of karma doing its best work, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload.